you very much. Thank you, all of you, for coming here today. Thank you to Jeanette and the Let's Talk team for inviting me here to speak. I want to leave as much time as I can for discussion, so I'm just going to sketch out some really important big points, and then hopefully we can have a good discussion later. So I do encourage you, please start thinking of questions. Today's discussion, of course, has gained increased relevance because of the recent changes to the Constitution regarding the elected presidency, which, if passed, of course, it's been passed, right, will limit the next election to a Malay candidate. And it's been widely suggested, of course, and acknowledged by our law minister in a town hall, that the Constitution was changed because the leading independent candidate and the favorite for the election is Chinese. As in, the law minister acknowledged that that was one reason that had been floating about, not that that was the reason. But the idea that's very widespread is that the use of race in this case is to further political control. And that's what I'm going to discuss today, the political economy of race in Singapore. And the thing is, because throughout the history of the British Empire, throughout the history of Malaya, and therefore of Singapore as well, race has always been a tool of political control, and that's why race exists in Singapore today. Let's start then by taking a look at Article 152, and particularly subsection 2, which is the government shall exercise its functions in such a manner as to recognize the special position of the Malays, who are the indigenous people of Singapore, and accordingly it's the responsibility of government to protect, safeguard, support, foster and promote their political, educational, religious, economic, social and cultural interests and the Malay language. Okay, so let's stop and think about this for a moment. How do you define Malay? Right? Because nowhere here is Malay really defined. Are you Malay? Am I Malay? Can we become Malay? Right? The fact is, as we know, as is commonly known, there is no biological basis for race. That's been disproven a long time ago. Otherwise, you have no need for all these committees to determine what your race is, right? You could just take a blood test and then it would definitively determine that you are that race. But of course, if every Singaporean took a blood test, we'd find every single one of us has ancestry from all over the place, all over the world. We all have mixed ancestry with DNA drawing from all sorts of different regions. Biologically, it's simply impossible to draw a circle around any group of people and say, this group is a race. So, how do we define race? How do we define specifically being Malay in Singapore? And that actually stems from our merger with Malaysia in 1963. The definition of Malay, as used in Singapore to this point, is the same definition which we inherited when we merged with the Federation of Malaya, and is enshrined to this day as Article 160 of the Malaysian Constitution. It defines a Malay person as someone with three criteria, right? Professes the religion of Islam, habitually speaks the Malay language, and conforms to Malay custom. Now, these are the only three criteria to being Malay. And you think about it, there is no genetic or ethnic component to that definition. Let me repeat that because that's really important, right? There is no genetic or ethnic definition to being Malay. In as much as there is a condition of being indigenous, right? The Constitution of Malaysia also says that you have to be someone or the descendant of someone who was a resident of Malaya, Sabah, Sarawak, or Singapore before Merdeka Day, right? That's 31st August 1957. So again, that's an inclusive definition. That means all of us. That is not an exclusive definition. And in practice today in Malaysia, when a non-Malay converts to Islam, he or she is said to masuk Melayu, right? To become a Malay. That person is automatically assumed to be fluent in Malay, and because of their proximity to the Malay community, is assumed to be living like a Malay. So in practice, there's really only one condition for being Malay, and that's to be a Muslim. But of course, we know that being a Muslim and being a Malay are not synonymous, right? There are plenty of Muslims around the world who aren't Malay. So what's up with that? And how can you have a constitutional article saying that Malays are the indigenous people, which it specifically says, right, the indigenous people, and they have a special position and special rights, when anyone can become Malay? When the definition is an inclusive one, not an exclusive one. That's a central contradiction of this article, and one that we've never really addressed in all our history. So what does this mean for Singapore? Because of course I've been talking about Malaysia, and we separated from Malaysia in 1965. Because after we separated, of course, we were no longer governed by the federal constitution. Indeed, nowhere in our state and our national constitution is Malay defined. So even if we use this definition that we inherited from Malaysia in practice, right, what does it mean for us, and what does it mean for Article 152? And to answer that question, we need to understand the history of Singapore and the broader history of race, and most importantly, the fact that the inextricable relationship between race and colonialism. You see, race theory was invented in the 1700s, and before it was invented, people identified themselves in different ways, but much more measurable ways, by place of birth, by religion, by language, by occupation, by class, by who your overlord is, right? Who your master is, by things you can see, you can measure, or have some sort of objective basis. If you think about yourself, right, Chinese, Indian, Malay, how you self-identify, right? Place of birth, dialect group, religion, right? And of course it was the same for Malay before the British arrived. And local politics indeed existed. It's been well documented by Tony Milner, who wrote a book talking about how Malays existed, the native peoples of Malay existed in a state, a condition which he called kerajaan. The condition of having a Raja, right? Their relationship was to their lord. So now if you think about the terms Chinese, Indian, and Malay, where do these words come from? These are colonial inventions. They are a result of the colonial encounter between the peoples of those regions with European colonialism. These are categories invented by Europeans and imposed as part of the process of European colonialism. So race then is a foreign concept to Singapore, to Malaya, that was introduced by the British. So the next time someone complains about, bringing in these Western values, ideologies, remind them race is also a Western ideology. So we should get rid of it, sure, yeah. Right? Because you see, unlike the French Empire, right, the French had this civilizing mission. We want to make everyone French because being French is the greatest thing there could be. The British didn't care about that. The British came here for one purpose and one purpose only, to make money. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, they had a few other things, but their primary purpose was money, right? And the British went around the world looking for resources to exploit. And when they found it, they would set up factories, they would set up transport networks, and they would enlist the natives to help them exploit these resources. They would forcibly integrate native economies and societies into global capitalism, so that global capital could flow in and resources could flow back to Britain. And what they wanted to do was exploit the natives for maximum capital return. Where they thought it was necessary, they would impose direct British rule, because that would ensure that British laws, right, on which British contracts are enforced, which enabled them to keep the peace so that their exploitation of the natives could continue unhindered. And their priority at all times was to do it as cheaply as possible. There's not a lot of point making a huge amount of money if you have to spend a lot of money doing it as well. So if you're British, what do, right? Especially since there's so few of you, and there are just so many Africans and Indians and Malayans. Well, first, you need to work with the local structure, the local rulers. You work with those already in power. You make them your collaborators. You prop them up. And then you freeze local society so that they will always be in charge and they will always be your local collaborator. So that's why, for example, Raffles recognized Tunku Hussein as the Sultan of Johor, even though there was already a Sultan, Tunku Abdul Rahman, because Tunku Abdul Rahman was a Dutch collaborator, and the British, Raffles, needed a British collaborator, so he appointed Tunku Hussein as the Sultan. And then, once you free society, right, you want to make sure the rule of your local collaborators is never questioned. So you have to invest these societies with ideology, right? Whatever is most convenient to ensure that these local rulers are unchallenged. It could be religion, it could be custom, or it could be race. It could be the divine right to rule, right? You could be the Sultan as the unquestioned head of the religion, all that sort of thing. But whatever happens, they must be the unquestioned head of the local native people. Now, second, you want to make money, right? So you need to import your global networks to quickly transform the local economy into something which is tightly integrated into global capitalism. And if the locals get in your way, if local entrepreneurs get in your way, then you've got to sweep them aside. And that's what happened to Singapore, because Singapore's success, our trading networks were built on the backs of the Bugis traders. It is Bugis trading networks which made Singapore such a great success. But from the British point of view, one of the problems with the Bugis community is that they don't have local addresses, right? You have a seafaring, almost nomadic community who don't follow the British rules, right? They don't have fixed addresses. If you don't have a fixed address, you can't have a contract in the British system. If you don't have a contract, you can't make money, you can't enforce laws, right? So the British wanted clients who played by their rules, and that's where the Chinese and Indians came in. The Chinese and Indians were imported in large numbers, either as capital, right? Financiers, traders, merchants, or as labor. Our coolies, our slave indentured labor, or as convict labor. And you bring all these people in, and it's the catch is, right, that once you bring all these people in, you don't want to cause problems between these new different groups who speak different languages, and you don't want to have your local collaborator have his or his rule questioned. So what's the cheapest way to do that? Well, keep them apart, right? So let's say the people speaking Chinese from China just go over there, right? And the Indians, you go over there, and then the local natives, you stay over there, you know, and you don't interact. You keep them apart. Cheap and easy. You're not racist. It's just cheap and easy. It's just the easiest thing to do. So the same thing happens then within the various communities. Each one appoints a leader. You already have the Sultan, with the Chinese, you have the Kapitan China, and so on. And they then represent their whole community to you. Again, very simple, very easy system. But over time, throughout the course of the 19th century, these communities grow and grow and grow. And you have people born in Malaya who've never seen any other land, who call this land their home, right? And the British now need to govern all these people to keep making money. They need to keep track of these people. So you got to create a bureaucracy to track all these large groups of people. And a government needs to keep track of citizens, not just for security purposes, but for planning, and perhaps most importantly, for tax purposes. You want to make money. So the bureaucracy then, you need to take all these people, but you need to then put them into convenient boxes so that the bureaucracy knows how to treat them. And that's where you get the census. And with the census, you get people self-identifying. You give them these neat little boxes, and they get to tick them off and say whether they are Chinese or Indian or Malay/Malaysian, which was the collective term for the people native to the archipelago. So this then determines how your government treats you, which courts they send you to, what language they use, what kind of welfare system, right? Do you fall under the Chinese Protectorate or, you know, under the local native scheme or whatever? You know, all these things determine how the very few British in Singapore and Malaya govern huge populations. And so you see how race is introduced into Malaya. It's about political control and it's about making money. And that's our problem, because when they created this system, right, it already didn't reflect the rule on the ground, you know, the local reality on the ground. Where do you put the Peranakans, for example, right? But that was in the 1800s. And you imagine, 150 years later, this system is still in place. It still governs how we lead our lives, how we relate to the bureaucracy, and yet today it's even much more further removed from reality. With globalization, I mean, it's removed from reality so far that it's almost ludicrous. And yet today, Malaysian and Singaporean society remains fundamentally a creation of British colonialism and capitalism on a system designed for colonial exploitation and political control and capital extraction, for control and for making money, not for nation building. And that's our problem. This is a legacy of race throughout the whole British Empire. Right? Studies have shown that if you are a former British colony, chances are today you have a higher level of development than non-British former colonies, because the British were very good at integrating their colonies into global capital. But at the same time, every former British colony has a horrible legacy of race. You know, think about it, right? The USA, Fiji, Guyana, Nigeria, Uganda, South Africa, Kenya, India, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, right? This is the Janus face of the British Empire, right? You are wealthy, but you hate each other. And that was what was institutionalized at independence. Communities which were all these generations politically, culturally, socially separate, occupying the same space with no basis to form a new nation. Malaya as a whole, right, the peninsula, including Singapore, had more Chinese than Malays in 1946. So, to ensure the continued primacy of their local collaborators, of the Malay elite after independence, the British separated the biggest city with the most Chinese, Singapore, right, along with other reasons, the British bought the strategic naval base, all that. They separated Singapore, they partitioned Malaya in two, and they set up a system where there was a constitution in Malaya that specifically enshrined Malay rights. So this whole thing that we talk about, Malay special rights in Malaya, the origin was to protect British interests after independence. It was to protect the interests of the Malay elite, the Malay aristocracy, who did not, after 200 years of being under the thumb of the British, they did not then want to be under the thumb of someone else. They wanted to be the bullies, not be bullied. So they insisted on this system, and that's why we have it today. And that's why the definition of Malay is what it is in Article 160 of the Malayan Constitution. Because it's not about race. It's about political power. It's about control. If you speak Malay, if you're a Muslim, if you live according to Malay custom, then automatically, by definition, you accept that the Malay aristocracy, the Malay elite, are in a superior position above you by dint of custom, by dint of religion, right? They don't care about race. It's all about money and power. And we see the consequences of that today in Malaysia, where citizens do not have equal rights, where some citizens are far more privileged than others, where race and religion are highly contested political issues because the stakes are so high. If you can control race and religion in Malaysia, if you can keep the money flowing, you control power. And that's what keeps Najib in power, right? He's openly corrupt at this point. We know that he stole all this money. But the Malaysian political system is not responsive to elections or the people's will. It is by design set up to be responsive to those who manipulate race and religion the best. And Najib is a master at it. And that's where we are heading in Singapore. We have a society here also designed on the same premises. But of course we are far subtler and much more technocratic about it. And also, immediately after independence, because of the events between 63 and 65, we were forced into a path where we had to distinguish ourselves from what was happening north of the causeway. And so we swerved away from this racial, racist politics to distinguish ourselves. But since the 80s, with the introduction of the GRCs, we have slowly brought race back into the discussion, brought race back into our politics. Like Malaysia, race forms part of how the ruling elite in Singapore control us. They control political power, they distribute patronage, and they perpetuate their grip on power. Michael Barr has studied the ruling elite of Singapore, terrific book, and he shows there are 5 overwhelming characteristics for the ruling elite of Singapore, right? They are male. They have a pre-existing relationship with the Lee family. They are English educated. They were scholars who were in the military. And they're all Chinese. And so this myth of race is used to provide justification for many policies that allow politicians to perpetuate this control, perpetuate this overwhelmingly Chinese elite by allowing them to take control of our lives in incredibly intimate ways. So I'm sure you're all familiar with them, but just a few examples. Where you live, for example, right? The racial quotas for the HDB force minorities to become perpetual minorities in their own constituencies. And people will say to me, oh, this prevents ghettoization. You know, you spread everyone out, everyone has to get along. And then I always ask them, hey, what do you think of Penang? And they go, oh, that's a great state. And I'm like, do you think Penang should become Malay majority? And like, no, why? You know, it's so well run. See, my point is that enclaves, right, work both ways. Forced relocation is a mace when what you really need to deal with these issues with discrimination is a scalpel. Or education, right? SAP schools, right? They're all Chinese. And they exist because of the superior bargaining position of the Chinese educational community who got them in exchange for the government shutting down Chinese language schools. But Malay language schools, Tamil language schools, they don't get these same privileges because of their far weaker bargaining position. Minorities can take Chinese as their second language, but Chinese can't take Malay as their second language. Minorities have to sinicize to become accepted in Singapore. Race, of course, underpins a massive patronage network, right? Mendaki and Sinda give the PAP and the PAP allied grassroots leaders huge funds to disburse. And this provides levers of control and influence in their communities. People who may have more popular support, more popular legitimacy, but who don't support the government, who disagree with the government, are not selected for leadership of these grassroots organizations, and so they don't have these huge funds, they cannot compete. And of course the PAP openly admits to this. Why should we support people who don't support us? Right? Never mind if they're not representative of the people they're supposed to represent. And of course we have politics with GRCs. Before the GRCs, our parliament ran on average 30% non-Chinese. Since the GRCs, 20% non-Chinese. It is harder for a non-Chinese to get into parliament today, unless of course you're a PAP candidate. And of course now the government has stopped pretending that race doesn't matter to our politics by saying, oh, the next prime minister must be a Chinese man, right? Thus disqualifying the most popular and best qualified candidate. And now they say that the president has to be a minority, right? Again, thus disqualifying the most popular candidate. Because it's not about race, right? Race is a smokescreen. It's about power. It's always been about power. From the very beginning of our establishment as a British colony, it's been about power and control. So it comes back to my first question then. What race are you? How do you determine what race you are? Who puts you in your box? And under the proposed amendments tabled in Parliament this week, your race is actually going to be determined by a subcommittee. 5 people appointed by the government who make their decisions, I don't know how, arbitrarily. So I quote our law minister, right, Minister Shanmugam, who said in last September, after the government tabled the bill on the amendments to the elected presidency, he said, in the GRC system today, it already takes into account the possibility of mixed marriages. There is a 2-step test. First, what do you consider yourself as? So let's take a Malay Chinese or a child of Malay Chinese parents. Does he or she consider himself or herself primarily Malay or Chinese? That's the first criteria. I guess in the minister's world, he's never heard of Branca. So. Then he continues, if he considers himself Chinese, then he cannot qualify as Malay. So culturally, what is he? What does he consider himself? Then, there is also a committee that looks to see whether, you say you are Malay, but are you accepted by the community as Malay? So that's the 2-step criteria, because people can try and game the system. So, note first, he doesn't mention what's on your IC, right? He says first, how do you identify yourself? So that gives an element of self-identification. But then he says, does this committee or community accept you as that race? Well, who sits on this committee? Who represents the community? And you'll find that the majority of the people appointed to this committee will be part of the ruling elite, or people who have already been appointed by the government, who are part of these extensive patronage networks. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there is a big conspiracy, I'm not saying that there is corruption, I am saying that the way the system is set up, the incentive structures naturally lead people, even the most well-meaning people, into conclusions which support the existing networks of power in Singapore, which support the current ruling elite. They have no interest in doing anything different, right? Because they have no interest in anything but perpetuating the status quo. That's the incentive structures, the forces working again around us that we subconsciously respond to. And these developments take us in a dangerous direction. I mean, think about it. Certificates for race, giving people arbitrary power to determine your race, giving people political power based on your ability to prove your identification as a race. These have all been done before throughout history. And spoiler alert, never has it ended well. Never. So, it's not a good thing. And anyone who challenges, right, these policies is told powerful myths about how we are constantly teetering on the edge of racial strife, so all this is necessary, right? But as I've explained in the past, right, that is also a myth. It's not true. Singapore has never, I repeat, never had a riot motivated primarily by race. Maria Hertog was an anti-colonial riot. The 1964 riots were the result of political manipulation on both sides of the causeway. And indeed, that was the line of the Singapore government after 64. The Singapore government's official story was that this was not a racial riot, this was a riot caused by agents provocateur from KL. And they submitted a memorandum to the federal government saying that to that effect. But what changed was that in 1996, with national education, certain values needed to be propagated throughout the system, including this idea of race. And that's why this narrative then changed in 96, 97, and that's why after all these events of 64, we rushed to introduce Racial Harmony Day in 1997. Right? There's such an urgency, why wait 30 years? Because it was about political control, about propaganda, about ideology that needed to be propagated. And this underlines the point that race is a function, it's a myth designed for political control. And we do have serious problems of discrimination in Singapore. We do need to protect minority rights. But they cannot be dealt with a mechanism that has no basis in reality, that is designed by the colonials for colonial purposes. So to sum up, 3 points to take away today. There is no such thing as race. There's no biological basis. 2, race was invented, introduced into this country for the purposes of political control, for money and power. And 3, it continues to be used as such today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. P.J. Thum. I'd like to introduce Alfian Syed. So would you like to put your hand for Alfian? Alfian?
I would like to make use of this very nice set by sitting down. Thank you all for coming and joining us on this Saturday afternoon. I think later during the discussion, I have a few responses to PJ, but I think I shall deliver what I want to deliver first and talk about some things that you've raised, including this idea of the post-racial, I suppose, right? Which is an ideal, I feel. But there's also a realist in me that feels that racialized thinking has been so ingrained in our society. It's really this ideological boulder that's going to. So, with that kind of a frame, then how can we, let's say, argue for certain things like minority rights with that kind of framework? In addition, also, I think, sure, the British introduced, but I think there were certain moments in Singapore history that were quite traumatic that gave rise to more kinds of racialized thinking, one of which is the Japanese occupation, for example. So I think the differential treatment of the different races by the Japanese, if you were Chinese, for example, you're treated much, much worse because of your assumed support for China during the Sino-Japanese War, right? If you're Malay, potentially they might see you as the native and let you off a bit. If you're Indian, they will try to, there was this whole thing about the Indian National Army, right? So we became a certain agent of decolonization. So I think that kind of differential treatment further racialized Singaporeans. Okay, but I want to go back in time, actually not as far back as PJ, just to 2009. So in 2009, the Straits Times ran a feature article asking whether minorities in Singapore deserve a special position. What the article failed to recognize, however, was the special position enjoyed by Chinese Singaporeans. Simply put, these are the privileges that come from being members of the majority race. When I was younger, I used to question why local advertisements rarely featured non-Chinese faces. Bank and credit card companies were notorious for projecting images of well-heeled Chinese yuppies. I wondered why TV Mobile on the bus showed Chinese programs which only served to marginalize those of us sitting in the bus who didn't understand the language. But I came to realize that equal representation was simply not possible in a country where one particular ethnic community formed the bulk of the target market. I began to appreciate the difficulties of any minority, no matter how entrepreneurial, to penetrate communal business networks where Ponzi links have ossified over several generations. It's not simply economic supremacy that the majority enjoys, but also political hegemony. Singapore practices a form of electoral democracy, which by its definition establishes rule by a majority. Because of the HDB quota system, which mandates that the ethnic composition in each estate should mirror that of the nation as a whole, minority communities do not form any significant electoral bloc. While areas such as Kebangan, Geylang Serai, and the Southern Islands used to be Malay-dominated strongholds, this has been diluted over time. We can contrast this, for example, with the state of Penang in Malaysia, where the Chinese actually form the majority. Ironically, the attempt to prevent certain neighborhoods from becoming Malay or Indian enclaves has actually resulted in each ward becoming a Chinese enclave. However, it is the privilege of the majority to be exempted from accusations of forming enclaves, or for that matter, ghettos, in areas where they are concentrated, simply because those words are inextricably linked with minorities. So, again in 2009, there was this interesting exchange with then NMP Viswa Sadasivan. I don't know how many of you remember this, and Lee Kuan Yew was very agitated by it. Basically what Viswa said was, so I quote here, "We as a society need to address apparent contradictions and mixed signals. Examples are the issue of Malay Muslims in the SAF, SAP schools and cultural elitism, the need for ethnic-based self-help groups, the need for us to maintain the current racial distribution in society, and whether Singapore is ready for an ethnic minority prime minister." And then he got a response from Lee Kuan Yew, which is classic Lee Kuan Yew. So this is what he says. "The Constitution of Singapore enjoins us to specially," I'm not trying to do impersonation, enjoins us to specially look after the position of the Malays and other minorities. Our Constitution states expressly that it is the duty of the government not to treat everybody as equal. It's not reality, it's not practical, it will lead to grave and irreparable damage if we work on that principle. So that's interesting, huh? Okay. And then he goes on to say, "You suggest to the Malays that we abolish the Article 152 provisions in the Constitution. You will have grave disquiet. We start on the basis that this is reality." Okay, so then this is a classic Lee Kuan Yew swipe. "We will not be able to get a Chinese minister or an Indian minister to persuade Malay parents to look after their daughters more carefully and not have teenage pregnancies which lead to failed marriages. Can a Chinese MP or an Indian MP do that? The Malays will say to him, 'You are interfering in my private life.'" By the way, to my knowledge, if kids don't listen to their parents, I don't think they listen to MPs. No matter what race, right? So this was, I felt, again, a rehashing of that whole, it's pet topic, cultural deficit. So the implication here is that Malay culture is so problematic that it gives rise to teenage pregnancy, and this kinds of behavior and failed marriages, etc. Without also looking at so many other factors that shape why people, have sex early, including the quality of sex education in schools. So, Before leaving, before ending, Lee Kuan Yew also takes a swipe at Viswa. Really, I mean, it's a whole series of low blows, right? So he goes, NMP Viswa used to work in Sinda. I'm told for 10 years. He will know Indians are not equal. Brahmins will not be in Sinda. It is the non-Brahmins who are in Sinda. So I think it is dangerous to allow such highfalutin ideas to go undemolished and mislead Singapore. So this is interesting. I mean, that bit at the end is an ad hominem attack, right? Basically suggesting, oh, Viswa, you shouldn't ask for equality because I think you yourself have been complicit in practices of unequal treatment in Sinda. But what I find interesting is this idea of Lee Kuan Yew's idea that in the Constitution we have to treat people unequally. And I think that misses the point a little because I want to make a distinction between equality and justice. So there's a definition here of equality, which is equality is a social, civil, and legal concept that every member of the population is essentially the same as every other one, regardless of their differences in appearance, habits, language, religion, origins, or major activities such as work or play. The thing about justice, though, is that when people are treated dissimilarly or differentiated from each other in otherwise identical situations, then they will attempt to seek relief through justice. So, how I read something like the protection of minority rights, for example, is an acknowledgement that we are not equal and that it is ameliorated, it is remedial, it is corrective. Okay? So let me give you an example. Okay, a concrete example is of this remedial clause, which is an issue of justice, can be found in the television industry. In Singapore, there are dedicated channels for ethnic minorities, namely the Surya channel for Malays and the Thum channel for Indians. It would be extremely difficult for these channels to survive on revenue from advertising alone. Not only do they suffer from lower viewership than, say, Channel 8 and Channel U, the dedicated Mandarin channels, but advertisers will also recognize that the demographic profile of the viewers is hardly appealing. The Malay community, for example, is predominantly working class, and for advertisers this would mean lower purchasing power. Thus, much of the budget for programming on Surya and Vasantham is derived from television licensing fees. This is a practice commonly known as public service broadcasting, acknowledged on the website of the MDA. These licensing fees are essential in helping with the production of public service programs as they are less commercially viable and require funding support. So without constitutional safeguards for minorities, a multiracial country like Singapore risks sliding into majoritarianism. Okay, I'll skip the next part. Okay, so Lee Kuan Yew, in mentioning 152, has elected. There's the thing about the government electing that particular clause in narrow terms, restricting this to providing tertiary education for the Malay minority. Now, a more generous interpretation of 152, for example, might have considered granting a special assistance plan status to Malay medium schools, such as formerly the Sekolah Menengah Tun Sri Lanang, Sekolah Menengah Sanggila Utama, a privilege that was offered to 10 Chinese medium schools. In some instances, one can even argue that the government has acted in violation of Article 152. In the year 2000, the expropriation of Istana Kampung Glam, a symbol of Malay sovereignty on the island, surely did not demonstrate the political will to safeguard Malay cultural interests. The banning of the Tudong national schools in 2002 cannot be considered the act that fosters Malay religious interests. And the fact that the madrasas in Singapore do not receive adequate funding from the Ministry of Education contravenes an obligation to support Malay educational interests. So this is something that Lily has also written about, the idea that it's a minimalist rather than an interventionist interpretation of Article 152. So as such, one wonders about the actual constitutional force of Article 152. Lee has raised 152 as some kind of stumbling block to equality, yet the article itself has been subjected to unequal and arbitrary application in state policies. So, as I write this, I find myself wondering why it is difficult for someone in the majority to appreciate his or her privileged status in Singapore. I believe that there are two factors that can explain this lack of majority consciousness among Chinese Singaporeans. The first is the fact that the Chinese did not come to the region as colonial settlers. Their arrival was facilitated by colonial capitalism, which often relied on indentured labor. Thus, the Chinese do not see themselves as responsible for dispossessing native populations of their status and territories and exploiting indigenous resources. As such, they do not carry the baggage of what has often been referred to as post-colonial guilt. Secondly, there are some who believe that the Chinese educated community has itself been marginalized, a phenomenon that has led sociologist Zhao Binghua to coin the term the minoritization of the Chinese community. I do have sympathy for such sentiments, although sometimes I wonder if a distinction needs to be made between government subjugation of leftist and communist activities, which tended to be associated with the Chinese educated, and an actual repression of Chinese culture. Nevertheless, this sense of minoritization has led to a certain attitude in majority-minority relations. How can the Chinese, who are themselves oppressed, be seen as the oppressors? No matter what the Chinese here feel about their status as a majority, the fact remains that this is a status that's not likely to change. Lee Kuan Yew himself has hinted at the need to maintain this racial balance in a speech given in mid-August that year. So by race, he says, the fertility rate is 1.91 for Malays, 1.19 for Indians, and 1.14 for Chinese. If we continue this way without new immigrants and PRs and their children doing national service, the composition of our SAF will change. So please remember that. I don't know about composition of SAF, but I suppose there'll be more people doing police and civil defense. So, in conclusion, the tendency of any majority, if left unchecked, is towards tyranny. The tendency of any minority, if left unattended, is towards alienation. The presence of Article 152, which is a constitutional guarantee of minority protection, goes a long way towards alleviating the damaging forces of such vectors in our society. So I believe, far from undermining equality, Article 152 is an attempt to rectify asymmetries of power to achieve parity among those who are not born equal. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfian. And we are now going to go for a short break of 15 minutes. But before you go, may I remind you to hold your thoughts, because at the next segment will be Dr. Rahim. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. So I would like, if you have any questions, to try and formulate them as we, move along, and so that you can articulate your questions in a succinct manner. The toilets are over this way. During the break, do visit our bookstore, because we're hoping to raise funds to cover our event. And also, please, donate generously to our ushers, and who'll be coming around with boxes. And so do come back in 15 minutes' time. We'll give you a call. Thanks.